Jane Britton, a 23-year-old graduate student in the anthropology department at Harvard University, was found dead under mysterious circumstances in her own apartment. Despite the widespread publicity the case received, as well as the presence of some bizarre theories regarding the possible causes and circumstances of the girl's death, the investigation failed to uncover even a single lead that would have helped them track down the killer. The investigation into this enigmatic and horrifying case dragged on for many long decades. It was only after almost half a century, thanks to the efforts of a group of concerned amateur enthusiasts who took it upon themselves to study the circumstances of Jane's death, that the truth about this crime finally came to light. Jane was born on May 17, 1945, in Boston, Massachusetts, into a family of well-known and respected people. Her father held the position of vice president at a prestigious women's college, while her mother was a historian. Thanks to this, the girl became fascinated with history from a very young age and already in her school years firmly decided that she would definitely become an anthropologist. In addition to this, young Jane adored horseback riding, had an extraordinary talent for playing the piano, and loved to draw. Successfully graduating from school with honors, she became a student at the college where her father worked. There, the talented girl quickly gained a reputation as one of the most gifted students. Her brilliant successes allowed Jane, after graduating from college, to enter the graduate school at Harvard University in the anthropology department, where she undertook writing a doctoral dissertation. Already in her second year of graduate school, she had the opportunity to go on an archaeological dig in Iran under the direction of a well-known scientist. During this expedition, the young researcher not only proved herself excellently but also made several important discoveries. Despite her academic achievements, Jane was very sociable and easily found common ground with all the students. At the university, she started a romance with a classmate named James. On January 7, 1969, the girl, who had just turned 23, was supposed to have her final exams. Jane eagerly awaited the end of her studies, hoping to finally embark on a brilliant career in her chosen field. However, that day, for some reason, she never showed up for the exam. Her boyfriend James, surprised by such a strange act, tried several times to call his beloved before the start of the exam, but she did not answer the phone. None of the teachers or students could explain the girl's absence either. Eventually, the worried James decided to go to Jane's apartment, which was located about a quarter of an hour's walk from the university campus. Having climbed to the right floor, he knocked on the door, but no one answered from inside. Instead, their mutual friend named Donald, also a student, peeked out from the neighboring apartment. Hearing that Jane had missed such an important exam, he replied that he had not seen the girl since the previous evening and had not heard any sounds from her apartment that would indicate that she was currently at home. James banged on the door several more times unsuccessfully, after which he became truly alarmed. He remembered that the lock on it often jammed, so the guy tried to simply yank the handle. The door opened. Inside the apartment, at first glance, everything looked familiar, except that it was terribly cold there, completely inappropriate for a warm home. Going into the kitchen, James saw that the window was wide open, despite the fierce January frosts outside. Looking into Jane's bedroom, the guy saw that his girlfriend was lying face up on the bed. Her nightgown was pulled up all the way to her neck, so the embarrassed James hastily left the room and called Donald's wife, asking her to check if Jane was all right. At first, James assumed that his beloved had simply fallen asleep or, perhaps, was feeling unwell. However, when a moment later Donald's pale-as-a-sheet wife ran out of the apartment, unable to utter a word, he instantly understood everything. Something was very, very wrong. James rushed back to the bedroom. This time his gaze immediately fell on Jane's face, covered with a coat and some piece of carpet. Pulling them off, the guy was stunned, the girl was dead. He immediately called the police. For the officers who arrived at the call, it took only one look at the body to realize, it was murder. Having handed over the body to forensic experts for further study, the detectives proceeded to carefully examine the crime scene. First of all, their attention was drawn to the fact that in the victim's home, everything was in its place, money, jewelry, and other valuables. This immediately ruled out robbery as a possible motive for the murder. In addition, there were no signs of a struggle anywhere. This led the investigators to believe that the criminal most likely attacked the girl unexpectedly when she was carelessly sleeping. This version was also supported by the fact that none of the residents of the neighboring apartments heard anything suspicious that night. Forensic experts, after carefully examining the body, concluded that death occurred from several powerful blows with a blunt heavy object, most likely a hammer, to the head. They also found traces of brutal on the girl's body. From a conversation with James, the police learned that the previous evening, he and Jane, along with other students, had sat in a restaurant, after which the couple went to the skating rink. Having escorted his beloved home, James left around 11:30 at night. After questioning the residents of the house, the investigators found out that about an hour later, Jane briefly visited the neighbors, where they drank a glass of cherry wine each. After that, no one saw her again. Based on the fact that, according to the conclusions of forensic experts, death occurred approximately 10 hours before the discovery of the body, the detectives assumed that the criminal attacked the girl shortly after she returned to her apartment. Unfortunately, a further thorough inspection of the dwelling did not provide the investigation with any significant evidence or leads. Forensic scientists found several fingerprints that did not belong to either the victim or her neighbors or acquaintances. However, finding their match in the fingerprint database was unsuccessful. As for how the killer got into the apartment, the police had several versions. Firstly, they found out that the lock on the front door was broken, so the intruder could have gotten inside that way. Secondly, the detectives assumed that the criminal could have climbed into the dwelling through the window. Like the locks on the doors, the locks on the windows were extremely unreliable, they could be easily opened from the outside. Despite the fact that Jane's apartment was located on the 4th floor, a fire escape led directly to her window, which anyone could reach. Soon, the investigators found indirect confirmation of the window version. After talking with the residents of the house, they came across a child who had heard suspicious noises coming from the fire escape. However, a problem arose. According to this child, the sounds came from there around 9 p.m., while Jane came home with her boyfriend only at 10:30. Another witness told the police that he saw some man running out of their house around 1:30 in the morning. Unfortunately, according to the witness, it was not possible to discern any noticeable signs of this stranger. The only thing the eyewitness could say was that the man was of average build, about 1.80 meters tall. Despite the fact that the testimony about the man running out of the building around 1:30 in the morning coincided with the approximate time of Jane's murder, without additional details, this information was of little value to the investigation. The detectives merely shrugged their shoulders, there were too few specifics. Analyzing the testimony of both witnesses together, the police put forward the assumption, it is quite possible that the killer really climbed the fire escape as early as 9 p.m., after which he sat there for several hours, waiting for his victim. Meanwhile, the deceased's friend Donald told the investigators an interesting fact. That fateful evening, even before Jane returned home, he briefly visited her apartment to take some of the groceries that he and his wife kept in their friend's refrigerator. According to Donald, he did not notice anything suspicious inside. This could mean two options: either the criminal was really hiding on the fire escape at that time, or one of the two witnesses, either Donald or the child who heard the noise, was mistaken about the time in their testimony. However, the detectives did not rule out another possibility: it is quite possible that these episodes have nothing to do with the murder at all. The investigation revealed that the residents of the house had a habit of leaving windows wide open all year round, even in the middle of winter. The reason was banal: the apartments were terribly hot due to excessive heating. In the morning, the news of the brutal murder of the student spread like wildfire through the university campus, stirring minds. Soon, journalists also got involved. After some time, the whole country was already talking about this horrifying case, and the police began to experience considerable pressure from all sides. Students at one of America's most prestigious universities were now afraid to stick their noses out of their rooms until Jane's killer was at large. Rumors immediately began to circulate at the university that one of their own might be involved in the crime. The fact is that in the deceased's bedroom and on her body, experts found a mysterious reddish powder, outwardly similar to ochre or iron oxide. One of the professors in the anthropology department noted that in some ancient cultures, for example, in Iran, where Jane had recently been on a scientific expedition, there was a ritual of sprinkling the bodies of the dead with a similar mixture. It was from this observation that the theory grew, according to which the killer could turn out to be someone else from Jane's anthropology classmates who was familiar with the aforementioned burial rite. It is even quite possible that one of them went on that expedition with Jane. This version was also reinforced by the fact that the criminal did not even touch the victim's valuables and cash. It gave the impression that the murder was committed for some personal motives. The investigators did not really believe in such an explanation, but they did not completely reject it either. They compiled a list of about 100 students and teachers who specialized in anthropology and carefully checked each one. Unfortunately, this did not yield any results. Some time later, another version surfaced in the investigation: a serial killer could be involved in Jane's murder. 5 years earlier, in the same building, 2 floors below, another student was brutally killed in the same way. Then the detectives suggested that a notorious serial strangler nicknamed the Boston Strangler might be behind the crime, and he even confessed to the deed. However, many people doubted his involvement, believing that the maniac could simply take the blame for someone else's crime, as often happens. Moreover, at the time of Jane's death, he had long been locked up in a psychiatric clinic, so he could not have committed this new murder in any way. While detectives wandered aimlessly through the labyrinths of theories alone, having no worthwhile lead, local newspaper reporters relished various versions of the event in their columns, while simultaneously accusing Harvard University of negligence. It turned out that Harvard had purchased this building for a student dormitory only a few years ago. The problem was that at the time of settlement, the building was in a terrible state. In almost every apartment, the locks either did not work at all or hopelessly jammed. The same was true for the windows. Residents complained that most of them could be easily opened from the outside by simply pulling the frame. So soon the press began to reproach the university leadership that by settling students in such a neglected building, they were deliberately exposing them to danger. Meanwhile, the cops continued to turn over every pebble in search of at least some clue. They connected James and the neighbors to the lie detector. They interrogated several more potential suspects. They even stuck hidden cameras at Jane's funeral to record everyone present. The identity of each of these people was carefully checked, but no connection with the murder was found. So the investigators were left empty-handed again. The following weeks passed just as fruitlessly, no progress. And then suddenly, on February 6, a month after Jane's death, the police stumbled upon the body of 50-year-old Adubin in her own apartment, located just 1.5 kilometers from the previous victim's house. The woman was found lying face down on the bed, with her nightgown pulled up to her head and several blankets thrown on top. As for the cause of death, forensic experts established that the unfortunate woman was put to sleep by several powerful blows to the skull with something heavy, obviously when she was carelessly sleeping. As soon as journalists learned about Adubin's murder, they immediately began to draw parallels with the recent death of student Jane Britton. The similarity in the details of the crimes was striking, but for some reason, the police flatly refused to acknowledge any connection between these two horrific cases. The official statement of law enforcement was laconic: no meaningful similarity was found, the version of the same killer is not even being considered. Such a sharp and categorical denial caused a wave of public skepticism. Students and campus residents mostly had no doubt, a serial maniac was operating in the vicinity, who could strike again at any moment. Unfortunately, despite all efforts, the investigators failed to find a single clue that would lead them to the killer of Adubin. As in the case of Jane, the investigation quickly reached a dead end. And in the Britton case itself, no progress was observed, so it was actually put on the back burner. From time to time in the following years, detectives would take it out of the archive, combing through the details again and again in search of a fresh trail, but each time it ended in vain. Eventually, the case was transferred from the jurisdiction of the local police to the State Department. They also tried to conduct their own investigation but also failed to get to the truth. In the late 1980s, when DNA analysis began to be actively used in forensics, detectives decided to take another close look at all the physical evidence in Jane's case. Among them was a set of biological samples taken from the victim's body. The material was sent for examination to the laboratory, and among the samples, they found a trace of the rapist's semen. Unfortunately, it was too small to make a full genetic profile of the suspect. Later, when the FBI acquired its own nationwide DNA database, the samples were run through all available matches again. However, this attempt also did not bring any results. In 2006, investigators repeated the procedure, hoping that the most modern DNA analysis equipment would be more accurate than its predecessors of a decade ago. But here, too, they were met with failure. Since then, the investigation into the murder of Jane Britton had actually frozen for several more years. An unexpected breakthrough occurred thanks to a group of concerned enthusiasts who took it upon themselves to unravel this bloody tangle. The first of them was an elderly writer who, at the dawn of his journalistic career, worked as a crime reporter and covered this high-profile murder. Now, having retired, the man decided to get to the truth at all costs and write a book about this intricate story. A young journalist, a Harvard graduate, also joined the investigation. Having learned that such a brutal murder had taken place half a century ago behind the walls of her alma mater, she became passionate about the idea of trying to unravel this bloody tangle. The third member of the team was the administrator of a popular forum dedicated to unsolved crimes. She, too, was bursting with a desire to establish the truth at all costs. Starting with a thorough study of all the materials in Jane's case, they turned to the police with a request to give them access to all the physical evidence in the case. Unfortunately, the vast majority of their requests were rejected. The information that they still managed to obtain mainly consisted of old newspaper clippings with a rather superficial presentation of the facts. As it turned out, at that time such a refusal was a common practice for law enforcement officers in the state of Massachusetts, while in many other states the police were much more willing to meet halfway in such matters and shared information. Not wanting to put up with a brush-off, the group of enthusiasts filed an appeal to the court, demanding that they be given access to all the materials of the investigation. Among the arguments was the fact that increasing public awareness of long unsolved crimes had already repeatedly helped in their investigation, because people came to the police with fresh clues and leads. Unfortunately, the appellate court rejected their petition. But even this did not force the persistent truth-seekers to give up. In the following years, they regularly, time after time, bombarded the state attorney general's office with new lawsuits. And although all of them were also lost, tireless perseverance still bore fruit. In order to pacify the indefatigable enthusiasts who had been disturbing the police for years because of this case, in 2017 it was decided to resuscitate it and consider it again. First of all, experts once again took up the available biological samples of the killer. This time, using the most modern equipment, they managed to isolate the criminal's DNA in an amount sufficient for analysis. The profile was uploaded to the FBI's national database, and a possible match was soon obtained. The trail could belong to a man named Michael Sumpter. However, a problem arose here. Even such a partial match would still not be considered strong evidence in court. But the likelihood of obtaining a full-fledged DNA sample from Sumpter was no longer there, since he had died of cancer back in 2001. Despite this, the detectives took up a thorough study of his personality in search of new evidence. It turned out that Sumpter had 3 convictions for rape, which is why he got into the database of genetic profiles of criminals. Later, in 2010 and 2012, thanks to DNA matching, the police were able to attribute 2 more old murders committed in the 1970s to him. All these crimes of Sumpter took place in Boston, not far from Harvard University. Moreover, investigators found out that at the time of Jane Britton's death, he was dating a girl who lived very close to the crime scene. Now everything fell into place. Sumpter perfectly matched the description of the witness who saw a man running away from Jane's house that fateful night, both in height and build. All the facts indicated that the suspect could really be involved in the murder of the student. But how to get irrefutable proof when Sumpter himself had long been dead and it was no longer possible to take a sample of his DNA? The detectives resorted to tricks. Michael's own brother, his closest male relative, was still alive. The police tracked down the man and took a sample of genetic material from him. When experts conducted an analysis, it turned out that the brother's DNA really quite closely matched the traces of Jane's killer. However, there was still no complete identity. The fact is that the original semen sample from the victim's body at one time was so scanty and incomplete that it was now impossible to identify it with someone 100%. This time, the results showed that the circle of suspects was narrowed down to a range from 0.8% to 100% of all men on the planet. Despite the fact that we were talking about more than 350,000 people, in this particular case, the decisive role was played by the fact that Sumpter not only lived very close to the crime scene but also had convictions for similar crimes on his account. So in 2018, when 49 long years had passed since the tragic death of Jane Britton, the police convened a special press conference. It announced the stunning news: one of the loudest and most mysterious murders in the history of Boston had finally been solved. According to the investigation, on that fateful evening, Michael Sumpter secretly followed Jane to her house. There he lurked and patiently waited until the girl said goodbye to her boyfriend. And as soon as he left, the killer climbed into the victim's apartment through the kitchen window, scrambling there up the fire escape, and committed his terrible crime. The fact that the detectives managed to obtain at least a partial match of Sumpter's genetic profile with the National DNA Database only in 2017 also had a simple explanation. Despite the fact that the killer's samples had been stored by the police for more than a decade, experts simply could not previously isolate enough material to establish even such an incomplete match. Only recently, thanks to the latest, ultra-precise equipment, this task became feasible. On the other hand, in the case of two other old murders attributed to Sumpter, investigators had at their disposal much larger and better quality samples of biomaterial, which made it possible to establish a match relatively quickly. As for Adubin, the second victim whose mutilated body was found a month after Jane's death, the police never managed to prove Sumpter's involvement in her death. The fact is that in this episode, the investigators did not have any DNA samples of the killer at all, even partial ones, so it was not possible to check it for a match with Sumpter's profile. However, given the striking, downright sinister similarity in the handwriting of both murders, few doubted who had dealt with Adubin. The only thing that I would like to clarify at the end is the nature of the mysterious reddish powder that was found on Jane's body and in her room. Although initially the investigation was inclined to the version of some ancient burial ritual, later, as it turned out at the press conference, this idea was abandoned. Most likely, the police suggested, the strange powder is nothing more than ordinary paint that Jane used for her beloved drawings. So, despite all the difficulties and vicissitudes, one of the most intricate criminal mysteries of Boston, over which detectives fought unsuccessfully for almost half a century, was eventually unraveled. And this happened in large part thanks to the persistence of concerned amateur enthusiasts who, despite all the obstacles, tirelessly reminded the police about this case for years. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.